Hi there, Prairie Plant Girl here. Today I thought that we would have a little talk about planting guides. I think there's a lot of people getting into gardening in the last year or so, and there's always new gardeners, and one of the biggest questions for new gardeners is, when do I plant my seeds? When do I put my plants out? How does it work? So there's all sorts of planting guides that you can purchase or find for free online. One of the best planting guides that you can usually get is actually right with your seeds. But it can get confusing. And I think there's a few reasons for that, and there's a few things you need to look at when you're buying a planting guide especially, but even if you're just finding one for free and trying to use it. So let's just have a little look at what a planting guide is and how you want to use it and what you want to look out for when you're choosing one to use. So I have several here. They come in many varieties and styles. So you can get a basic kind of planting guide, which is going to be on the back of your seed pack, and we'll look at those a little bit more in a little while. Most seed packs will have that. Another thing that you could get is I have this book, and it's about growing vegetables in my type of climate. The author grows just in the next province over. They have a very similar climate. And in this book, it has a general guide here of when it's kind of safe to put some of your plants in the ground, as well as with each of the vegetables that are here. It kind of outlines a good idea of when to plant them. So it can come as an entire book. Another thing you can get is, I think this is a pretty popular one that can be purchased in the States especially, and I think even some different YouTubers have even had this branded for their channel. So I purchased this a couple years ago just to check it out, see what the hype was about. Then I also have some guides that I've printed off from online sites. So this is A Way to Garden, and they have a list with a lot of different vegetables and even some annuals. And it has a lot of good information about when to plant and how to plant and even transplanting. And this is another one. I don't even know where I got this from. It doesn't have a source printed on it anywhere, so I don't know where I got this. I've had this out for years. And again, it has times of when you could plant seeds outside or indoors, and the months, and just kind of highlights some of that for you month by month. And then I have this one, which is a little bit different, and this is a planting guide according to soil temperature. And this is actually one that I find to be one that I go and look at the most in my climate, because it's telling you when you can plant your seeds outside, and there's a lot of seeds that can handle very cold temperatures in the soil, and then others that just won't take that. So this is a handy one for just knowing the temperature of the soil, what it needs to be at minimum, and what it could be ultimately or optimally for growing. This one, I have it written on the bottom. It's Giant Veggies Gardener is where this came from. So maybe something to have a look at too, if that interests you. But so there's a large variety of ways that you can try and figure out when is the best time to plant your seeds, where you should be planting them, whether it's inside or outside, lots of different ways that we as gardeners can try and find that out. One of the things that you need to remember is these are all a guide. Everyone's gardening space, everyone's little microclimates in their yard or space that they have, and this type of soil they use, if they're using raised planters, if you're planting in the ground, if you're using containers, large containers, small containers, it all makes a difference in when you can plant your things outside especially, and how well they're going to do. So that all needs to be taken into account, and you as the gardener are really the only one that can really analyze all of those factors. You also need to analyze factors like how much snow you get and where the snow piles up in your space, or how much rain you get and where it kind of pools to. Because if any of those areas where you want to be growing your vegetables, and that's what we're mainly talking about here, vegetables or, you know, some annual plants, you want to know where, you know, what the conditions are like come planting time in that area. Because if it's too wet, or if there's been snow piled up there for a long time, it might be too cold still. The ground might not have thawed in the same way. Or maybe it dries out really fast in that area. Or maybe you have shade from something that you put there over the winter and it doesn't thaw out as fast. There's so many different factors. Maybe you have little caterpillar tunnels or hoops or something that are keeping the soil in the area warmer and you can get going sooner. If you're planting in a raised bed, they tend to thaw out and drain a little bit faster. If you're planting in containers where you're refreshing the soil every year, then you're going to find that you could be putting warm soil from indoors into those pots, and maybe the daytime temperatures are warm enough to be growing things much earlier, and then maybe you're just pulling them into a covered space on the nights where it's going to freeze still. So there's all sorts of factors to take into account. A lot of planting guides are based off of the growing zones. And here in North America, and I'm not sure where all uses the growing zones, but I know Canada and the US rely heavily on their packaging in that, talking about growing zones. And you need to understand what that means, because the USDA growing zones are based solely on the minimum temperature that that area gets. That's all they base their growing zones on, as far as I'm aware. So that's not really very many factors to help guide you. You know, there's growing zones that are going to be, you know, growing zone 5 in one part of the country and growing zone 5 in another part of the country are going to have, during the growing season, vastly different conditions. So basing your planting schedule off of how cold it gets in the winter for annual plants that you're not worried about in the winter is really not going to be helpful. In Canada, we have a little bit different way of classifying our growing zones. And in the last few years, they've started to take into account, yes, that minimum temperature, because that's important when you're growing perennials, which we're not really dealing with here, but that's why the growing zones kind of started in the first place. So that minimum temperature for the year is a big factor. But then they're also taking into account, they have frost-free dates, precipitation amounts, like sunshine, cloud cover kind of amounts. They have a lot of factors that they're taking into account. So it can be a little bit more helpful using the Canadian growing zone guides, but you're still going to have differences. You're still going to have one zone 3, like mine, that's 110 growing days, and you might have another one that's more or less frost-free growing days. So they're not really the best way to look at with growing zones, but I think the Canadian growing zones will give you a little bit more of a guide that way. When you're looking at a planting guide, to me, what you really want to be looking at is frost-free days and warm days in compared to, you know, like when you're going to be able to plant your plant out, because not everything can even go, like, you know, my last frost-free day is at the end of May, but we might still be having very cool days and very cool nights for a few weeks. And some things that, you know, you might say, oh, you could plant it out now. Well, in that guide, you know, they won't work. But at the same time, one of the bigger things that I find with a lot of growing guides for my area is, yeah, we might have a couple of weeks of cooler days after that last frost-free date, but then we are going to get hot for our area, not hot for, you know, down in the southern states or anything, but we're going to have trouble growing. You know, a lot of guides will tell you to put in those cool, loving plants and vegetables, and you grow those, you know, like your cauliflowers and your broccoli and your kale and all. You put that in the ground right around that last frost-free day and grow those, and they'll do great. And gardeners do that here, and then they're like, well, why did my stuff bolt? Why did it not head properly? What what went wrong. And it's because we tend to, in my area here, get too hot for some of those things early on in the season. And it can be difficult to grow them if you're not giving them kind of protection from that heat and getting them started earlier, you know. Like if you set seeds in the ground, which in a lot of places you can easily put seeds in the ground for broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. But if you do that here, by the time they're big enough to be producing their heads, it's probably going to be way too hot for those plants to actually produce properly. So that's something that you also need to take into account, is not just for your warm season vegetables, but your cool season vegetables too. And so I did say I wanted to get back to this one planting guide. And I'm not knocking this planting guide. It has a lot of amazing details in it. It has super information to it, but I don't think it totally applies to my part of the world. It does come with a really good detailed list of instructions, as well as a huge list of first frost and I think last frost. Yeah, last frost and first frost days for, I think you could probably be anywhere in Canada, the United States anyways, and find your dates or a place very close to where you are with the dates that are going to give you a very good idea of what your frost-free and first frost dates are. So that is something that is great to have if you don't know. If you don't know and you don't have this, you can just like put in your area code or your zip code or whatever, and last frost, average last frost or average first frost date, and usually you could find it pretty easily. But this guide has, so then you find out your date, and then it has this little line, and you line it up with your date, and mine is right around that time there. And so it has me planting things out. And if I followed this guide, I would be having things going in like pretty late in the year for what I need here. We need to kind of like, once things start, we need to kind of get planting and have plants to put out. So, you know, we need to make sure that we have things in the ground and they're growing so that they have time. A lot of plants take like between 70 to like 120 days, and we have 110 days. And that means the seed has to be up, the plant needs to be growing, planted out. It needs that time to mature just to start getting your harvest. So unless you only want like 1 or 2 weeks of harvest, you kind of need to get chop on the bit with these things. Now, what I found very comical about this planting guide is it has a flip side of when to plant things according to your first frost date. And for my zone, for my area and my dates, these two sides contradict each other completely. It's very interesting. And I'm sure for areas that have much longer growing seasons, this works really well, this simple little chart. And it's a very nice little size, and it has a ton of information on it. It has things to companion plant. It has, you know, how much per certain feet of row you need to plant to get so much harvest, and how much to space them, and whether to plant them, you know, plant them inside or plant them outdoors. It has great information on it. But I would say for my zone, this is not really going to cut it. It is a fun thing to look at though. And it does have some information. I do still look back at it sometimes just to see, like, the companion planting is very easy and simple on this little guide. And it, you know, the amounts to plant, the spacing to plant, sun or shade, different things, those recommendations on here can be kind of handy to just look at this little thing. So I still use it. I just don't use it for necessarily when to really be planting my things out. It also doesn't have a huge list of plants on it. It has a decent amount. It probably has a lot of the basics. And you could probably kind of transfer some of that information if you know your plants and your plant vegetable families. You could probably transfer a lot of the information from what's listed here to other plants. But like I said, I'm not saying don't use this, but I'm saying know your area and your weather and your growing conditions if you're going to be using this to, you know, with any of these planting guides. You can't just use them as the be all and end all and think that it's all going to be good. There's going to be variants that you need to be aware of. Um, it's the same thing with these. These ones are, I think, based more in the UK, but I'm not sure. And in some ways, their growing schedules, I find, correspond more with ours. Most of those places tend to be kind of cooler weather. A lot of them don't get the same freeze that we get, though. They don't get the same winter cold. So they might be able to be putting things outside sooner than we could because their ground isn't as frozen. You know, so the cool weather crops that can handle a bit of a freeze can be going outside much earlier than they could be here because we still have, you know, a foot of snow on the ground and 6 inches of frost in the ground still. But they can be really helpful. And if you look at the ones especially that talk about, you know, whether you can direct sow your seed right outdoors or if you need to start it inside or if you have that option. And that's always a nice thing to look at. And I like ones that have a lot of different plants listed. So that's helpful. And you see I've put all sorts of notes and things on mine and kind of tried to glean what I can from different sources and I make it work. And this one is kind of the same thing. It's very similar. They line up almost the same, but it's just visually looks a little bit different. So it might be something that works better for, you know, different brains work differently. So, but again, this might not work for a different climate. Now these, I think both of them, I could go in and pick my growing zone or something like that, or maybe my last frost date. I've had them printed for a few years. And I think that's how it got this readout for me, is I kind of put in some sort of information about where I grow. And then it was able to determine things that way. Again, this is just your soil temperatures. I really think this is a very helpful thing. But at the same time, you still have to have a general idea. Because, I mean, knowing, you know, that your tomato seeds can go in at, you know, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but it would be better at 70 to 95. Well, that doesn't really help you if you would be much better off starting them indoors 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. You know, you're waiting for the soil to warm up and you're getting behind. So it's helpful, but you do still need to have some knowledge, some idea of when to start things with that. Seed packets, if you buy them somewhat locally, they should have somewhat general idea of what you need for your growing area. And they're based off of your last frost date, which is going to be helpful. So they can have a lot of different formats. Like this one has just a nice little chart. It's easy to read, glance at, and find it. I find a lot of the seed companies do these little write-ups. Oops, put the right side on there. So they'll do a little write-up. And sometimes these are very generalized for certain plants. But for the most part, they'll give you some good information about when to plant them and whether you're starting it inside or outside. And what it is when they're saying when to plant it, they're not going to tell you, usually they're not going to say anyways, like start it in March or April. They're going to tell you start it so many weeks before your last frost date or so many weeks before planting out. The ones that say before planting out, you're going to have to do your research and find out when it's safe to put those plants outside. But it still gives you a good idea. This one has that as well. And I've actually, oh no, I've underlined how many days this is. But that's something else you need to know with your plants when you're choosing your plants. You know how many frost-free days you have. You know, you need to find out, you know, how warm it needs to be before your plant can go outside, because that's usually what that days to maturity is. So then you need to find those days to maturity and see if that plant can even come to maturity in a time frame that you're happy with for your growing area. These seeds happen to be 70 days. So out of 110, I'm going to start these inside because they're peppers. And then I'm going to plant them out, you know, probably, depending what my spring is like here this year, but probably the end of May, early June. Just kind of depends. Sometimes our cold weather drags on here. But then I'll plant them out. And then I know that about 70 days after they've been planted outside is when I'm going to be able to start getting peppers. So that's something, you know, you need to take into account when you're planting as well. I don't want to buy plants that say they have a 120 or 130 days to maturity. It just doesn't work here for me. Lots of you, that's going to work great. You're like, yes, bring them on. But that's what I have. Again, I said this book here just has a very basic little chart in the front of a general idea of, 5 weeks before your last frost date, these things could probably go in the ground if your ground's workable. Right around your frost date, these things could go in the ground as seeds, and then like so many weeks after your frost date, these things could get planted out or put in as seeds. So that's just a good basic guide, and like I said, they have, a little bit more detail with each vegetable that's in there. And then I have just gone through over these many, many years of planting and growing, I've kind of made my own charts for my things and what I want to grow. And this one is just a really basic little write-up that I've done, and it just has the name of the vegetable, and I mean like not the variety, just like this is beans. And generally when I'm talking about beans here, I usually grow bush beans. This is gonna be the first year I've ever grown anything else, so I may have to alter that. And then I'm like, can you direct seed? Yes. Here, check, you can direct seed those. Now you could start them early, but here I just don't find it worth it. And that's something you need to know too, is your indoor growing space. How many of these things are you willing to start early? And then I have, outdoor sow date relative to last frost. And I have at, so right around last frost. Now, not everyone's gonna agree with that here, but beans, as long as my soil has warmed up, I can put them in then and be fairly safe, because they're going to take a little bit to get started and come up. And by the time they're up, I'm probably in the clear. If I plant them on the last frost date, if my soil is warm enough, then by the time they actually are sprouted and above ground, I'm probably pretty safe. Like I said, we can get frost all year long, but I just need to know that I might have to go cover them up and have, but for me, I'm fine with planting them like at my frost date or like a week later, and usually they'll come up fine for me. And then I have, if it needs to be sown indoors, I have an indoor sow date that I have down the side here. So for onions, I have sowing them from anywhere from February 16th to March 9th, sowing the seeds indoors. So that's just what I've done with all the information that I've looked at over the years and put together. I've just made something that's a little bit more specific to me and my growing area and my growing needs and my space. So it's not a bad idea to kind of take notes, pay attention, and kind of start to figure something out for yourself, because all of our yards, my neighbor's yard is going to be different than my yard, just depending on the structures we have and the soil that we have in our space, and the type of beds and pots and things that we're growing in. So it's good to know that. Oh, I wanted to show you one other thing with seed packages is the one company that I ordered new from this year. They sent me out a whole bunch of packages, and they specialize in one type of plant, and that's peppers. And so they just, in their order, they just had little baggies of the seeds with the name of the seed and the variety and that on it. But then they sent out this little card, and it actually has growing instructions on it. So instead of putting it on each individual package like this, they just put it on a card and included it with your order. I did order from another company this year, and they are a very, very small Saskatchewan seed grower, and they just came and actually cut up recycled envelopes, and they just like hand wrote the name of the seed and sometimes the variety on it. And then I actually had to go hunting all over the internet to try and find out information for some of the ones that I wasn't familiar with. So that is something that you have to be aware it can happen. Don't always count on your seed package having the information you need. But lots of times, and especially with big companies, you'll get a lot of information just from that. So I guess to sum this up, planting guides are great. They can be helpful, but they're not a guaranteed format for your space, what you're growing, and what your weather conditions are. They're just a general guide. Like it says, it's a guide. And you need to do a little bit of research and a little bit of trial and error sometimes. So if you planted something according to a seed guide and it did not do well, don't just say, like if you planted your, again, say your cauliflower, you planted it by seed. You had a seed guide. It said, yep, put the seeds in the ground, 2 weeks before your last frost date or whatever it said. And you did that. And then your cauliflower did not grow right and it got curdy and nasty. And you're like, oh, I just can't grow cauliflower. No, it might have been the variety of cauliflower wasn't right for your climate and your conditions. And it might have been that you just didn't have enough of a cool spring in your area to grow cauliflower from seed in the ground like that, without some sort of shading and protection. So you have to remember that, like, it's all just a trial and error thing and figuring it out. And these are all just guides to kind of to guide you and figure out what you need to do. So I say, like you see, I've been gardening for a lot of years. I can't even 20, 30, I don't know, a lot of years now. And I have, I don't know how many guides laying there and probably more if I just went through my shelves. I don't use any of them as the be all and end all guide. They're all just helping me to decide what I want to do for that year. And I'm going to be watching my weather and my climate, how much snow we get and things like that when I'm deciding what to put out and when to put it out. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it wasn't too long and rambly. But I think there's a lot of confusion out there about how to use these things and how to follow them. Thanks for watching. Bye.